Dragons falling from the sky. A man, hair grayed with age, but not yet wholly white, stooped down upon the side of a lonely, bone-drowned hill, and peered with grass-green eyes on the tiny skull in his hand. He turned the oddly shaped cranium in his palm to peer at it from a few different angles. Dissatisfaction coloring his features, he held the skull out by one of its curling, ram-like horns. "I don't think this will suffice," he grumbled. "No, not for the whistle, but perhaps it could still serve." With his free hand, the middle-aged man scratched his pate. "What do you think, Remus?" There was no answer. "Now, Remus, you—" There was a loud twanging sound, followed by an inhuman screech of pain. Another one? My, there are a lot out today. Maybe we should— Sven's words were cut short by an insistent tugging at the hood of his dark blue traveling cloak. Sven turned at once and beheld a giant, nigh man-sized, lizard-like monstrosity barreling down the hill toward him on all fours. A crossbow bolt was buried in its right eye, and blood flowed freely down its cheek, but that did not stop it. It screeched at Sven in savage rage, baring its massive fangs as it drew closer. Sven looked irritably on the beast. He raised up his left hand, throwing back the baggy sleeve of his brown robe. "Shoo! Shoo!" he exclaimed, as he loosed a tuft of orange flame from the palm of his raised hand. The flames lapped over the green scales of the great lizard, and it recoiled from the heat. Sven peered with leery caution on the great lizard. After a few moments of thrashing, smashing its long body into the bones smothering the hill, sending up quite the racket, the lizard roared and charged once more. Anger flaring in his green eyes and causing him to bare his teeth, Sven raised his palm against the creature and loosed another fiercer gout of orange fire against it, striking it square in the face this time. "Away with you, I say! Away, foul creature!" he howled at the beast. The great lizard shook its head ferociously, smashing down into the bones, spitting flames in its violence in gobs and droplets to scatter across the side of the hill. When it saw at last no ultimate hope of putting out the flames, the giant lizard let out one last great howl, and then turned and fled back the way it had come up the hill in a madness of agony and rage. Sven released the torrent of his fire, though he did keep his hand raised, until at last he saw the tail of the beast disappear over the top of the hill, and even a little after that, waiting until the smoke of the poor creature's burning vanished from sight. Sven slumped forward in exhaustion, setting both of his hands amidst the bones on the side of the hill. He panted heavily for a time, and sweat dripped from his brow. When he had recovered enough, he chuckled. "That was a fair bit more strenuous than the last, wasn't it, Remus?" Sven took a few more heavy breaths, and then turned so that he could sit down on the hill. He winced at first, as a few bones poked at him, but, after wiggling in a bit, he found a comfortable enough seat. "All right, give it here." At once, a small and very furry hand placed a tiny crossbow into Sven's hands. With an effort, Sven cocked the string back into place. "We're not done out here yet." He sighed as he pulled a bolt scaled just right to the diminutive crossbow from a small quiver hidden away in his satchel. Knocking the bolt, he added, "And I certainly wouldn't want to be caught unaware by anything like that." He looked on the small, readied crossbow and sighed again. Here. Sven offered the crossbow up, and the long-tailed monkey, sitting on his shoulder, took it. The monkey had grass-green eyes of exactly the same hue as Sven's own, and they flickered with unnatural intelligence as they examined the small crossbow that fit almost perfectly in his tiny hands. Satisfied that the weapon was ready to use, Remus started scanning the hillside once more, just in case the giant lizard came back. Sven, meanwhile, gazed out across the valley before him. It was not a lofty place, nor even a particularly remarkable one, just a collection of small hills with a slow and ponderously winding river snaking through it. Yet here was a multitude of bones, so vast and numerous that they covered the ground and choked it, blacking out the sun beneath their sheer weight from so far as Sven could see to well behind him over the crest of the hill. Yet the death that had taken all of the little creatures had also become the death of all else that lived in this gruesome vale. A few trees still stood, dotted here and there, but they were barren, leafless and dead. From beneath the carpet of bones, not a single blade of grass arose, nor any flower, and not even the sturdiest, most clinging of weeds could endure here. Nothing of green remained. Wearying of surveilling the somber scene of the bone-choked vale, Sven glanced down to his hand. Still in his grasp was the small lizard-like skull. He lifted it up and peered into the empty sockets where the little creature's eyes had once been. Its horns made it different from the creature Sven had seen off with Remus's help, but not different enough. A pang of revulsion seized Sven for an instant, but he dispelled it with a shake of his head. "Remus, what do you think of this one?" Sven held up the skull, and Remus turned from his watch to take a gander at it. The intelligent green eyes peered on the skull for a time, but then Remus gave a non-committal shrug of his shoulders and turned back to his watch. Sven sighed. "That's what I was thinking too. Oh well." Sven stood up, careful not to let his hands touch the hillside, and then, taking out a brown cloth and using it for wrapping, he bundled up the skull for traveling and set it neatly into his satchel. Sven started down the slope, making his way toward the winding river. Just a few steps down, however, he noticed something he hadn't before. Jutting out from beneath a mound of smaller bones lower on the hill was a single unusually large one. His eyes brightening with excitement, Sven rushed down the slope. Eagerly he grabbed up the bone, but it resisted his attempt to pull it loose. He yanked on it once or twice more to no avail. "Hang on, Remus. This one's being difficult." Remus nodded his head in answer and took a firm grip on the collar of Sven's cloak. "All right, then here we go." Planting his feet firmly on the hillside, dislodging many lesser bones and sending them scrabbling down the slope, Sven prepared for one more massive pull. With a grunt of exertion, he ripped the long bone free of the morass. However, he found that he'd extracted more than just the one bone. Exhumed from the hillside was an almost complete skeleton, still held together by the not entirely consumed sinews of the beast. The skeleton had 2 arms, 2 legs, 2 wings sprouting from its back, and a long serpent-like neck and tail, and its head was vaguely alligator-like, with rows of sharp teeth and the beginning nubs of horns protruding from its skull. It was unmistakably the skeleton of a young dragon. Sven grinned enormously, pure delight shining in his face. "Look, Remus, look!" he shouted for joy. With some difficulty, Sven dragged the body of the young dragon up the slope, and then he pounced upon it. With furious gestures, he dug his hands into the detritus that still obscured the skeleton and swept it all away. Revealed to him then was the nearly complete form of a dragon, markedly older than the one whose skull he'd found farther up the hill. It was far larger, being almost as big as Sven himself was, and its body was considerably more developed, with long, slender limbs and a broad chest. It was while he was inspecting the chest that Sven's mirth began to wane, and then, sure enough, it turned into somber seriousness, and then even to sorrow. "What did they do to you, little one?" he asked, shaking his head. Some of the young dragon's ribs had been broken. That was not unusual of the skeletons about the hill. Indeed, few of them had many bones at all that were not damaged in some way. It was for that exact reason that Sven had such trouble finding components. Yet this was different. This skeleton was mostly intact, with few fractures or breakages to speak of. This creature had become sturdier as it grew, and so its bones had weathered their time on the hill better than most of the others had. No, the damage done to it was most specific. A hole had been punctured through this dragon's ribcage and part of its spine. There, 2 of the ribs and the spine had been practically cut, and that gash was far too narrow to have been inflicted by the fangs of the lizard-like scavenging beasts. This dragon had been slain, run through with a blade of some sort. Sven looked grimly on the wound, and disgust flared in him, bringing fire to his eyes and reverberating in his voice. Bad enough they persist in this barbarity, without slaughtering even more for the fun of it. Remus looked worriedly at Sven, drawing his attention by laying a furry little hand on his cheek. Sven looked at Remus, and after a few long moments, his hatred subsided. "I know, Remus." He sighed deeply and sat back on the bone-strewn hill. "I know." Sven lowered his head then and sat in silence, breathing in and out to recover his composure. "It's not like I actually know why they killed this little one. I doubt I ever will, either." The idea troubled him deeply, bringing back a measure of his anger. Sven shook his head. Well, nothing for it. He stood up and went to stand beside the bones of the young murdered dragon. He searched the skeleton from top to bottom and priced out a handful of particularly promising bones, taking pieces from all 6 of its limbs and a few from its neck, spine, and tail. Satisfied with his finds, he tucked them all away as best he could in his satchel, which was not very well, as many of them were far too long to be stuffed inside, and so he was forced to leave them jutting out. Giving up on his latest effort to scrunch the bones into the satchel without breaking them, he sighed heavily. He raised his gaze up to survey the hilltop behind him. He saw nothing there that he hadn't already been over and rejected. Then he looked down to the murdered dragon once more. He looked grimly on that death, his outrage mounting in him once more. He closed his eyes and breathed deeply once more. "At least it will not have been utterly for nothing," he grumbled resignedly to himself. When he opened his eyes again, he allowed his gaze to linger mournfully on the slain dragon. As he watched, a shadow passed up the hill to darken the young dragon's resting place, graying out the white of his bones. Expecting a rain cloud, Sven sighed and lifted his head to peer upwards. His eyes drew wide in surprise. "No, it's today?" Advancing toward him was a vast sheet of darkness that swallowed up the whole of the valley and darkened the river. In just a few heartbeats, Sven and Remus were engulfed in the great shadow, and together they were swallowed by dread. Remus clung desperately to Sven's neck, as the middle-aged wizard cast his green gaze upward. Hanging in the sky, breaking the clouds and devouring the sunlight, was a vast city. Tall were the towers of that realm in the sky, and their shadows fell across the deathly veil like a colossal row of fangs. In open panic, Sven turned on his heels and ran upward. Stumbling and falling as bones gave way beneath his feet and scattered down the slope, Sven fought to reach the summit. In his haste, he scrambled directly into the patches of the hill, where his flames and the turmoil of the great lizard had set the bones ablaze, and some of those fires caught in his robes. Flaming with small lights scattered across his cloak and robes, he reached the top of the hill. Sprinting, he crossed the flat summit, and, without a care for what may lay beyond, he flung himself bodily over the far slope. Sven hit the slope hard, Remus barely managing to cling onto him. Sven eventually came to a halt, sprawled out across the slope. As the last clattering of the bones he'd dislodged with his fall subsided into silence, Sven raised his head. His gaze darted to either side and further down the slope. When he saw nothing, he shot up onto his hands and knees and turned back toward the summit of the hill. Still he saw nothing. Slow and cautious, overcome now by curiosity, Sven started to crawl his way back up the slope. As he moved on hand and knee, he dislodged and shifted many small bones, the culmination of hundreds of similar-shaped skeletons, and his robes and hands were blackened by the residues of those long-dead creatures. He started to cough as he disturbed the dust, and it was only with a great effort that he could keep himself from choking on the fumes his movements released. Remus lay flat upon Sven's back, Sven's cloak bunched up in his hands and feet as he ascended, not daring to so much as lift up his head, holding his green eyes tight shut. Sven reached the top of the slope, but he dared not stand, instead laying down so that he could look over the peak. High above, partially obscured by white clouds, the city hung motionless, halted in its course. Silence, save for the whistling of the wind over the crest of the hill, dominated the vale. Then the howling began.